Welcome to Awakening Channel. We have been censored by the main social media, and we do not have ads or monetize a YouTube channel, so, only with your support, we will be able to keep fighting for you. We do it for you. Become our supporter from only $1.5 a month. The world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who look at them without doing anything. Become our supporter. Together we can win. Victory of the light. Now the highlights, then the full video.
But I'm really quite concerned that there is a serious intent to kill a very large proportion of the population of the world. And when I looked at the vaccines, I had a number of concerns. One was all four of them, so that was the Janssen, J&J, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Moderna. They all were fundamentally the same design, whether they used mRNA or a viral communicated DNA. So the design of them, I would say it was toxic by design. It was always going to harm people. Next, unlike a classical vaccine, which is usually a killed piece or killed preparation of the infective organism in a little bit of oil or alum, something like that. That's a unit dose, so you know how much you're injecting to each person. With these vaccines, we're giving a unit dose of code. Now that code could be taken up well, copied into protein very efficiently, and might do so for a long time in one person. In another person, it might be taken up badly, copied inefficiently, and only briefly. So what I'm saying, and I'm absolutely certain about this as a pharmacologist and a toxicologist, is by choosing this design, the range of outcomes is probably 1,000 times worse than it would be for a conventional vaccine, because the actual amount of protein produced will vary by orders of magnitude more. It will. And I thought that was the explanation for why it is that many people had no side effects whatsoever, and others appeared to die. People would say, how could that possibly be true? And I've just explained it, that with an encoded vaccine, an unlucky individual might take up large quantities of it in their heart, in the coronary vessels, or in the cerebral veins in their head, and produce lots of spike protein for a long time. And those people might get myocarditis or cerebral vein sinus thrombosis and die. And someone else, it might be spread around the body in a sort of less dangerous place and not make so much spike protein. I thought that was an adequate explanation, but I don't think that's not the whole explanation anymore. The reason I thought it was an explanation was I made an assumption, which I was entitled to make, which is that the same stuff from a given manufacturer is in every single vial. Little glass vaccine vial. I believed and was entitled to believe that within a fraction of a percent, we had the same consistent quality and purity in every single injection. And therefore, the observed variation in behavior in people must be down to something such as the thing I just suggested. But as I'm going to come on to, unfortunately, we're now absolutely certain it's not the same stuff in every vial. And that means criminal acts are being committed. I am prepared to state and to prove that means it's not the same material in the lots that have produced bad side effects. I mean, what I've just told you, you may not appreciate the significance of it. It's not the same stuff. So if you thought it was the Pfizer BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine that was used in the clinical trials, some of the batches contain something different. They are lying, and I can use the L word all the time. If they want to come and sue me, do you know what? I would welcome it. You will lose, you guys. You will lose. So by all means, put me in my place and sue me. I look forward to seeing you in court.
Mike, I have no doubt that if we talk to all of the experts who we've spoken to, the psychologists, the psychiatrists, the epidemiologists, immunologists, the lawyers, the economists, they will all come to the same conclusion. This is intentional, premeditated mass murder. There's absolutely no doubt about it.
Now the full video.
What did they say? Well, they told us things like, this is an extremely lethal virus. If you catch it and get ill, you really could die. And remember the falling man face down in Wuhan. It's never happened anywhere else. It was pure theatre. And it turns out that it's not a particularly lethal virus. If it exists at all, it's about the same as a bad seasonal influenza. They used PCR testing repeatedly of swabs up noses and throats and led you to believe that these were highly accurate and could distinguish a clinically infected person from something that's not. And even the inventor, Kary Mullis, who's died, won a Nobel Prize for this technique, said you should never use it for this purpose. So I won't waste any more time, but they're still using these damn tests, and they're not reliable. They don't tell you anything, really. They also say you should wear masks. But masks have been extensively studied. Cloth masks, if anything, make you more likely to catch an unusual bacterial pneumonia because you're breathing through a filthy cloth. And the blue medical masks, they're not masks, actually. They're splash guards. Their purpose in hospitals is to stop blood and bodily fluid going into the nose and mouth of the attending healthcare worker. They've never been for filtering your breath, and obviously they don't do so. But they've told you to wear masks, and I think the purpose, certainly in me, it causes anxiety. I feel really awful wearing these things. Then they introduced lockdowns where you were all to stay at home, mostly, unless you were a poor manual worker, and then you had to go out to work. But the intelligentsia pretty much got paid to stay at home for very long periods of time, 3 months initially in the case of Britain. Lockdowns, they told us, would slow the spread of transmission of this virus. And lots of people thought it must obviously be so because it's a disease spread from person to person. But it didn't chime with me. And I'm embarrassed to say it took me months to realize why they wouldn't work. And it comes to this next lie, the idea of asymptomatic transmission, that you could be bearing the virus in your airways, yet have no symptoms, but nevertheless be able to spread enough of the stuff to infect a person nearby. That's not true. That's a flat lie. And whenever a scientific advisor, medical advisor to a government tells you things like asymptomatic transmission, I want you to know that they're not mistaken. They're lying because it's been studied and it's simply not true. And I can append a link to the notes for this program, which is an accumulation of statements by Fauci, a WHO doctor, and other people, actually, including me, goes through this argument. So if asymptomatic transmission doesn't occur, and I am certain it's epidemiologically irrelevant, I'm not saying it never occurs, but it's irrelevant. If it's irrelevant, why would you need to wear masks if you're well? Why would you need to test somebody who has not got symptoms? Why would you need to close your business or your school or the economy? So again, they've lied to you with the objective of both frightening you and I think also learning from financially experienced people. The other objective was to begin to destroy the economy and the sovereign currencies. And I think that's a continuing objective. They also lied to us and told us that there were no treatments for this respiratory viral infection. And I will take my hat off to Dr. Peter McCulloch as a leader, but he's representative of very many brave physicians who pushed back on this nihilism. And they have determined half a dozen really quite good therapies used progressively. So early on, you want to treat replication. In the middle phase, inflammation, and in the terminal phase, coagulation. And if you understand this multi-phase infection, you come to the conclusion, which is mine, that this is the most treatable respiratory viral illness ever. It's really quite surprising. But the use of those treatments are denied almost all around the world to the extent that people will be fined or even struck off as physicians. There's another lie there. And then they would say things like, well, we're not sure when you've had it if you've become immune. Well, I would say Immunology 101 tells you that that's simply not true. We know that the default understanding would be once you've shrugged off this virus, you will have taken high-resolution pictures of it, as it were, using your immune system. And if you see it again or with something related to it, like a variant, you will not get clinically ill, not for months, possibly many years. So that's another lie. And then the final one, and we'll come back to this, is that the vaccines are safe and effective, but that's a whole other story. So I've said that the evidence of a supranational plan is the discarding of simple, well-established pandemic preparedness plans and replacing them with this bunch of lies. and all the countries did it. And if someone would like to write to me with an explanation, an innocent explanation for this, I'd love to hear it. I want to be wrong, but unfortunately, I don't think I am. So if the motive is fear, I think the ultimate aim is control. And we will come onto this. The control mechanism that we can see being installed all around us are the so-called vaccine passports, a certificate first on paper and eventually a QR code on your phone that tells anyone who needs to know that you have received the requisite number of doses of these materials. And again, we'll come back to this, but that's nonsense. Economic destruction, I think, is on its way. There was a person who's very experienced in the City of London, and I heard them phoning into a radio show 3 weeks ago, and they said, I don't know anything about viruses, they said, but I do know a lot about finance. And they said, the amount of money, it's not even been borrowed, they've just printed it, actually created new money with an IOU from the government. They haven't sold gilt-edged certificates to investors. He said, it is my view that the sovereign currency is already destroyed. And the exchange rates ought to be moving violently against each other, and they're not, if you go and look. And that's because, as Catherine Austin-Fitts tells us, this is a conspiracy led by the central banking clique and their clients to take over the world, I think. Once they've done that, destroyed the economy, again, I'm paraphrasing from Catherine, a great financial reset, which will have us using our vax passes as digital ID, and central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, which you can look up. They are real and they are being talked about by all central banks. You won't like those. You really won't. It'll be the end of cash and of any privacy of any transaction. I know I go further than many, but I'm really quite concerned that there is a serious intent to kill a very large proportion of the population of the world. Again, I hope I'm wrong, but all of the measures required to get to this point of control through vaccine passports, digital ID, and to repeatedly vaccinate people, as we'll come on to, they certainly set the scene where a bad actor could introduce a gene sequence that will rob you of your health and kill you in a fairly predictable way at a fairly predictable rate per million doses and so on. So if somebody does want to depopulate, the setup is so perfect that it isn't completely crazy. Before I move on to the vaccines, and this is a concern I had, lots of people have said to me, Mike, this cannot possibly be the way you describe it. It looks compelling, I understand, but come on, you can't have a global conspiracy like this. It would leak, and it involves far too many people. You must be wrong. There must be another explanation. And I suggest to them that they look for a video on YouTube, surprisingly, by a German journalist called Paul Schreier, S-T-H-R-E-Y-E-R, Paul Schreier. And there's a 1-hour documentary called Pandemic Simulations, Preparation for a New Era, ? And when you watch that, your last rickety defense is that this isn't a well-organized, long-planned event, I think will disappear, and your heart will be in your boots by 20 minutes. Basically, all of the actors that you see around the table, including, say, an Event 201 that took place at the end of 2019, all of those players are currently taking the roles they had in the simulations and all around the world and doing exactly the things they did in the simulation. So that was the rehearsal. Those were the rehearsals, and there were more than a dozen of these damn things. And I think one of the bitterest moments for me was to realize that we were doing it to ourselves, that the US, UK, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, the Five Eyes, I think are the leading players. I don't know. I'm not going to say Russia's not involved or whatever, but it looks like the Edward Bernays School of Psychological Management has been used by the military intelligence people, and they've directed their weapons at their own people for 2 years through all these lies, repetitive messaging. And so what we want to do is to wake people up, because if we don't wake up, we are finished as a set of liberal democracies. I'm going to turn to the vaccines, but before I do that, I'll pause in case Ryan or others would want to steer me differently. But I'll say two things that they're not original sayings, but they strike me as very appropriate. I've seen on many message boards, when this all comes out, don't ask me how I knew. Ask yourself why you didn't. I mean, honestly, the evidence that things are amiss, I think, is so stark that you literally have to avert your eyes not to realize that things are really bad everywhere. And then this other thing, it's an old saying, I've heard this before, it makes me chuckle a little bit. If you're one step ahead of everybody else, you can be seen as a genius. If you're 2 steps ahead, you're a lunatic. And that's, I'm afraid, what I've been. My job as a scientist was to spot faint patterns in sparse data. That's what you do when you're trying to work out something that's new. And so I think I have been a couple of steps ahead, and probably sometimes wrong, but broadly, I think it is, sadly, roughly what I've said. So, Rainer, you can either wave me onwards, or you might want to ask any questions about that.
Mike, you're right on track. It
Okay.
was so important to hear this little introduction because it gives us an overview. Many of our viewers have only seen bits and pieces of this, so this gives them the whole picture. This is great. You're right on track.
All right, thank you. And Corvin, yes, if you could have the presentation available, I'll talk for a little bit, and then maybe we can pop those slides up, because I'll come back to that. It's a colleague's done an analysis that's, I think, quite striking when you see that. So to the vaccines. So I worked for the biopharmaceutical industry for 32 years. So I think you can take it as read, but I'll say it again. I am pro innovative new medicines, provided they're well developed, used appropriately, and of course the profile is safe enough considering the utility. So if you were treating a terminal cancer that had evaded surgery, current chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and so on, then you might be willing to take a drug that might kill 10% of the people. I don't know, 5%. If it might stretch your life out for many years, especially if you offer the chance of a cure. And some of these gene-based vaccines, I think the original intent of people like Dr. Malone and others was indeed to treat things like that. You could put a protein from your cancer into one of these vaccines and force your immune system to recognize it and destroy it. And that could provide exquisitely safe novel chemotherapy. But if you're going to treat effectively everyone on the planet, and you shouldn't do it anyway, but that's certainly the stated intent, you need safety, as Peter McCulloch would say. That's your first concern. Even better, even more than does it work, you need to make sure it's very safe, because you're going to be giving it potentially to billions of people. Now, I did say that my original training included toxicology, and I was taught by at least 2 people that founded the discipline of mechanistic toxicity. Can't remember their names now, Professor Jim Bridges and somebody else, Dennis Park. And they reminded us that in the 1950s, we didn't do toxicology in the drug industry. They would give it to 2 dogs and 5 chickens. And if the drug didn't kill them, they'd literally would start giving them to people. That's how bad things were 60 or 70 years ago. We had some strong wake-up calls at the end of the 60s, 70s, 50s, 60s, early 60s, with thalidomide, for example. It's a case that most people know about. At the time, they thought that babies were safe in mother's womb, and so wouldn't be a problem if you gave a pregnant woman a drug. And we now know that their fetus is exquisitely sensitive to perturbations in their environment. And so we never, ever give novel medical interventions to pregnant women, right? We'll come back to that. So we're definitely doing that. So because of my toxicological training and sort of a good understanding of what was required in drug R&D, new drug R&D, as soon as I looked at the vaccines, I was really quite frightened, because they were a novel type. These had never been mass dosed to human beings at all. So there would be no way of knowing what kind of effects, unwanted effects that might come about. And of course, what you do is careful empirical study. You should do all of the possible studies that, if you have a worry, rule of thumb would be, if you can think of a worry, you need to show why it's not going to happen. So you design an appropriate experiment. You have to try and drown your own puppy, as we used to call it. It's not a good job, but you have to do it. You can't just hope it'll be all right on the night. It rarely is. And when I looked at the vaccines, I had a number of concerns. One was all 4 of them. So that was the Janssen, J&J, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Moderna. They all were fundamentally the same design, whether they used mRNA or a viral communicated DNA, they encoded only the spike protein, the sort of sticky out bit from the ball and stick model of the virus that you've got. And I don't know to this day how they all chose just the spike protein, because I guessed, and we now know it's true, that human immunity relies much more on understanding the depth, the molecular structure inside the ball than the spikes. So I thought it was a bad, just immunologically uneducated thing just to pick the outside part. But secondly, it took me, I don't know, no more than half an hour of searching for research papers, abstracts, and so on, not so much on coronavirus spike protein because it was relatively new, but similar external proteins on other viruses. And within the half an hour, I realized that all of them have some kind of biological properties that are unwelcome. They're not just for anchoring the virus to the surface of a cell, which they do, but they're also biologically active, as you might expect, really. They interact with the immune system and also coagulation system. So, in fact, I saw Wolfgang Brodarg earlier, and he led off, and I joined a two-person a petition to the European Medicines Agency to say, don't approve these vaccines at this time. Here are a handful of concerns that we think are going to occur, and you need to slow down. And I think 2 of the 4 have been tested and proved correct, and the third one was looking pretty ropey. So the design of them, I would say it was toxic by design. It was always going to harm people. Next, unlike a classical vaccine, which is usually a killed piece or killed preparation of the infective organism in a little bit of oil or alum, something like that. That's a unit dose, so you know how much you're injecting into each person. With these vaccines, we're giving a unit dose of code. Now, that code could be taken up well, copied into protein very efficiently, and might do so for a long time in one person. In another person, it might be taken up badly, copied inefficiently, and only briefly. So what I'm saying, and I'm absolutely certain about this as a pharmacologist and a toxicologist, is by choosing this design, the range of outcomes is probably 1,000 times worse than it would be for a conventional vaccine, because the actual amount of protein produced will vary by orders of magnitude more. It will. And I thought that was the explanation for why it is that many people had no side effects whatsoever, and others appeared to die. People would say, how could that possibly be true? And I just explained it, that with an encoded vaccine, an unlucky individual might take up large quantities of it in their heart, in the coronary vessels, or in the cerebral veins in their head, and produce lots of spike protein for a long time. And those people might get myocarditis or cerebral vein sinus thrombosis and die. And someone else, it might be spread around the body in a sort of less dangerous place and not make so much spike protein. I thought that was an adequate explanation, but I don't think that's not the whole explanation anymore. The reason I thought it was an explanation was I made an assumption, which I was entitled to make, which is that the same stuff from a given manufacturer is in every single vial, little glass vaccine vial. I believed and was entitled to believe that within a fraction of a percent, we had the same consistent quality and purity in every single injection. And therefore, the observed variation in behavior in people must be down to something such as the thing I just suggested. But as I'm going to come on to, unfortunately, we're now absolutely certain it's not the same stuff in every vial. And that means criminal acts are being committed. So we will come on to that. Just before we do that, vaccines. Normally, a vaccine, if you administer it to a person, would usually be 1 dose, sometimes 2. It's never going to be a whole train of them. I'm seeing some countries already given the 4th vaccine, and others have talked about an open-ended series. You need to know vaccines are not like that. You do not need to be repeatedly dosed with something that would earn the title vaccine. 1 or 2 doses at most. So if it's more than that, it's not public health, and it's not public health. But here's the thing: a vaccine ought to, at minimum, I think, prevent you becoming ill with the pathogen against which you've been vaccinated. If it doesn't do that, I'm afraid it's not a vaccine. And as a consequence of protecting you against that organism, and it does that usually by killing off a new infection in an early stage before you're even symptomatic, that would mean you should have low viral load in your airway. So that's what keeps you safe after vaccination, or if you've acquired immunity. And the consequence of that is it usually reduces, if not stops, transmission. And we know now, lots of work in the literature, that people who've had this virus are immune to becoming ill a second time from either the original virus or a variant. And they don't transmit either. So we can see what good immunity can look like, because we've seen lots of cases of natural immunity. And authorities do agree. They concede that these vaccines do not prevent you catching it. They don't prevent you growing the same amount in your airway as an unvaccinated person, and they don't prevent transmission. So if someone's going to claim that they reduce the severity of your symptoms, I'd like to know what black magic is invoked, because I've just told you, it goes to your airway, it grows in the same way and transmits in the same way. I actually don't believe there's no mechanism now for this to suddenly intervene and stop you getting ill. I don't believe it. So I think most likely outcome now is they don't do anything useful at all, but they are unfortunately really very harmful. They're certainly toxic. So just a brief introduction, I think, to one of the best tracking systems in the world, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, VAERS. It's a US system. It was put in place about 30 years ago. And anyone who has an adverse event following vaccination, even if they not necessarily claiming it's necessarily caused by it, but in order to track the possibility, you're urged to report that. But unfortunately, the reporting rate is typically between 1% and 10% of adverse events. And there's every piece of evidence that has continued in recent years, in the recent year since the vaccine started rolling out. And yet there have been more adverse events and certainly many more deaths associated just with the COVID-19 vaccines than all the other vaccines in history that have been taken through this VAERS system. So there is no question. It's public data. It's your database. It's not mine. I haven't put anything in it. 85% of the reports were put in there by qualified healthcare professionals. So it's not true, as some have asserted, that, well, people are just putting in, spoiler claims and they're not real. They are absolutely real. There is something called it's often said that correlation is not causation, and that's true. Just because there's lots of reports doesn't necessarily mean that it's the vaccine. But there are things called Bradford-Hill criteria. So you can look up the Bradford-Hill criteria on Google or DuckDuckGo. I think there are 11 of them. And it gives you methods whereby you can determine whether the correlation is indeed causative or not. So I'll just give you a quick example. If there is acute toxicity in a vaccine, then you would expect to see a spike in injuries and deaths in the first few days after administration. If there's no connection whatsoever, then you would expect a much more smooth, low-level profile that would pay not much attention to when you were vaccinated. And when you look at it, I think more than a third of the adverse events occur on the day of dosing or the next 2 days, and then it rapidly falls off. So that's one of the Bradford-Hill criteria. Another one, I'll only mention this other one, is plausibility. If you have a theoretical reason for believing that it'll make your left leg turn blue, and you look at the adverse events and look, it's lots of blue left legs, that's much more compelling than if someone ended up with, say, a sore elbow, for which you had no predictive power. And what I would say is, on this occasion, we believe that these agents cause so-called thromboembolic disorder. So they affect coagulation, and you may bleed or clot. And so any vessels that are plugged up by clots, like strokes or heart attacks, deep vein thrombosis, or bleeding, like subarachnoid hemorrhage, any of those things are what you would predict. And lo and behold, they are present in VAERS at enormous numbers, unprecedented numbers. So the timing and the plausibility convinces me that these are causative. Mostly they are causative. And other people who are used to doing this, pathologists and others, have done a very thorough job. And unfortunately, it's definitely causative. Large numbers, and it's causative. where it comes to vaccines, wouldn't you expect, no, I put it to you, you would expect them to be deployed not just first, but only in the people who are at extraordinary risk from the pathogen. So in this case, we know it's elderly people who are already frail. And that's how they started. But very swiftly, they started coming down to the working age population, 50s, 40s. And as you're probably aware, we've now been trying to encourage people to get their children vaccinated. Now, I don't know about your part of the world, but in Sweden and Germany, I looked at the public record, not one healthy child has died as a consequence of being infected by this virus. Not one. So if I tell you that there are novel technology agents that are being proposed to be injected into your child, a child who's not at any risk from the virus and who also are very poor at transmitting it to other people because they generally don't get symptoms. And I just told you earlier about asymptomatic transmission is a lie. So please, I'm begging of you, whatever your neighbors say or your school teacher or your government advisor, I'm afraid they're lying or mistaken. You must not vaccinate your children. So we should target these interventions to those who might benefit from them because they generally will be willing to bear whatever the side effects are in exchange for that benefit. So healthy younger people, certainly 60 and down, really should not even have been on the map for vaccination because they survive. Secondly, there are really good treatments, as I've mentioned. And so with good therapies and people's strong immune system, if they're younger and well, there was no need to vaccinate the world. And then I've mentioned children. Yes, pregnant women. I have made a special examination of this from my toxicological background. I was just appalled when I heard a leading doctor, I think, from the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology in London. The Royal College is meant to be the acme of medical quality, hopefully in ethics. And this woman appeared on national radio and proceeded to tell people that if they were pregnant, they really should get vaccinated. And don't worry, these are perfectly safe. And I'll look you in the eye now and tell you that the studies have not been done to examine the safety of these vaccines in pregnancy. There's been no formal study. And there's no reproductive toxicology packages complete in industry. And I worked in industry for 32 years. I can tell you, we were not allowed to dose healthy female volunteers of childbearing age without insisting that they used highly effective contraceptive methods. And generally, we didn't do it at all. We just didn't do it until we had reproductive toxicology because we were all, rightly fearful of the potential to damage a growing baby. So it's literally nonsense. This is one of those things you should wake up to. Any listener knows that thalidomide changed the landscape forever in terms of precautions, in terms of medications in pregnant women for the reasons we understand. And so if your country's policy includes encouraging pregnant women to get vaccinated when they are by definition relatively young and relatively well, they probably wouldn't have got pregnant and therefore not likely to suffer severe effects of the virus. And why would it make any sense to administer these experimental therapies? And then worse than that, I've written affidavits and opinions to say there are 2 or 3 lines of evidence that would lead me to be extremely concerned for the potential for harms. And unfortunately, it actually does look like we were right about that. But I'm not going to push it any further. But that my main point in just what I said in the last few minutes, I've drifted a little bit, is just to say if this was a public health measure, you would only administer these vaccines to people who could benefit most from it, so the people who are most likely to get ill and die. And that would exclude healthy young people. It would certainly exclude children. It would definitely exclude pregnant women. And here's the other thing. It would definitely exclude anyone who's had the virus and recovered. There are scores of papers showing that people who've had the virus and recovered have a full complement of T cells of multiple types. That means that they will recognize the virus and any variants and remain well. And that is, in fact, the empirical observation. So when you see your governments threatening the unvaccinated, including people who've recovered, they are more immune than the people who've been vaccinated. So I just don't understand how anyone can go on about you're being, as it were, anti-vax. No, I'm anti-conspiracy theory. I'm anti-conspiracy fact. That's what's going on. So then moving on to the hot lots. So I mentioned earlier that I came up with an explanation for why many people have no side effects and some people get very ill and even die. And that might be true. But the reason I even thought of it was that you should expect pharmaceutical mass manufacturers to be good at least at one thing, and they are very good at this: consistent, high quality, purity manufacture from batch to batch to batch. They're very good at this because that's what their business is. They manufacture tablets, capsules, sprays, and injections in the billions of doses. If you think of something like Lipitor, a cholesterol-lowering drug, it's given to a substantial minority of the population in older age, one tablet a day forever. They would have made tens of billions of doses. Not easy to make these genetic vaccines, but making a few 100 million, I think, will be absolutely in the wheelhouse of Janssen, J&J, and Pfizer. At least Moderna was a new company, so I can't say. But I trusted that these companies were doing what I knew they were very good at doing, what they did for their business. And then I stumbled across a couple of people independently who'd been doing their own analysis of the VAERS database. What they were doing, and no one else seemed to have done it, was they were pulling the vaccine batch or lot number. It might be like 8 digits, 6 digits, a mixture of alphanumeric symbols, and comparing the profile of adverse events with comparing one lot to another lot to another lot with the same manufacturer. And their expectation would be there would be like a scattering of adverse events across all the states and all of the lots. But they didn't find that. This person found that something like 90% of the adverse events were associated with like less than 10% of the lots. And I remember seeing that some months ago, and I immediately knew the significance of it, because as I've said, although I'm not in any way a manufacturing expert, I worked for decades with people who were, and I knew their pride and the necessity of meeting the sort of anti-adulteration regulations, which require tremendously reproducible product from lot to lot to lot. And so I'll just briefly describe manufacturing of medical products like this. Proceeds in 2 steps. The first step is to make the active molecule. In this case, it would be mRNA or DNA with an attenuated virus. So we would think of that as the first step. It's drug substance. It's the actual active component. And then once you've got that, it will generally be formulated in some way. In this case, it's going to be in some sort of dilution material. It might be medical saline. Sometimes, though, it'll be mixed up with binding agents, colorings, lubricants, shiny coats on a capsule or a tablet. And that's called drug product. So the first step is to make the active, and the second step is to formulate it and finish with the drug product. Now, each of those steps is associated with a series of acts. You might start with a raw material, 2 raw materials, and then warm them up and manufacture a third product and then purify that. And that might be a step. And the manufacturer submits to the regulator its pharmaceutical production plan. And each of those steps is gone through by experts and the regulator, and they agree that the steps are appropriate and that the limits, the range of outcomes on testing are appropriate. And only if they are would you be permitted to go to step 2, 3, 4, 5 until you've completed all the steps. So I'm elaborating a little bit to tell you that they don't just throw everything into a bucket like home brewing beer, stir it a bit, and put it in the packet. This is done with just incredible levels of control. As you'd expect, you want it to be reproducible. So the effects of, if they follow what's called the good manufacturing practice or GMP manufacturing practices as required by a medical regulator, even for an emergency approved product, it should be the case that the lots are effectively contain the same stuff, wherever it was made and whenever it was made. It'd be the same stuff. And I know they're capable of doing that. Now, if that's true, if you draw a lot at random from the VAERS system and examine the outcomes, the performance, that is the number of people who've reported adverse events, it ought to be pretty similar from batch to batch to batch. If it's very different, I'm afraid I can tell you with certainty, and I would be able to prove this mathematically if needed in court. It's not possible to go from 2 or 3 adverse events reported for a given lot and another lot have 5,000 adverse events. It's not possible if you only vary the products a little bit. You might imagine, well, they're doing this at speed and it's novel, it might be being a bit hard on them. No, if you only have a small difference, you only get a small difference in the performance. If you go from nothing effectively to the worst outcomes ever reported to V8 ERS, I am prepared to state and to prove that that means it's not the same material in the lots that have produced bad side effects. I mean, what I've just told you, you may not appreciate the significance of it. It's not the same stuff. So if you thought it was the Pfizer BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine that was used in the clinical trials, some of the batches contain something different. I cannot know what it is, but it's definitely not the same stuff. So yes, I think, Corvin, if you could just throw open that short presentation. I've run over it a little bit, but I think it visually will help people. You don't need very much. So as I've explained on this first slide, if it contains the same product, the performance should be pretty similar, just a little variation. But if you step forward, yeah, so I'm not the analyst. In fact, it's an irony, I'm the person speaking. I'm the only person not capable of doing the sort of information technology. But one reason I'm speaking is because of my deep experience in pharmaceutical research and development and knowledge from people who are experienced about manufacture. And what I've described is true. And also the people who are doing this work, we're self-starters, we've got a degree of independence, and we're all speaking out because something awful is happening. If we move to the next slide, please, Corbin. As I've mentioned again in my introduction, it's quite normal, I'm afraid, for every medicine will have some kind of side effect. I think it was a very old, ancient physician, I think Paracelsus, that said all medicines are poisonous. It's just a question of dose. And that's kind of true, that rat poison used at very low doses, or its modern analogy, can be really useful to thin your blood. But that means you need consistency from dose to dose to dose. And it was true that in the first half of the 20th century, many pharmaceutical outfits that were probably quite small at the time were occasionally careless, if not outright reckless, and had adulterated products, that is, products that were not the same from tablet to tablet or injection to injection. And so that brought about sort of these FDA regulations that relate to so-called adulteration. And really, it's about reproducibility, purity, and so on. So next slide. Yes, so I think I've just said that. So for the lawyers, it's very important. My colleague who put this together taught me something I didn't know. Because those regulations were formed to make sure that badly manufactured products were never again foisted on the public, they said that if it's not made as you have described and made consistently, so there'll be a tiny variation, fraction of a percent perhaps, that's allowed batch to batch, we will declare it to be adulterated. And the thing is that adulteration per se, manufacturing and release of materials, which I assert and others in this team agree, are performing very differently one from another, by definition, means it's not the same stuff. By definition, it's adulterated. And I think by definition that they have broken various laws. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is really important. Again, the initial analyst just looked at the COVID-19 lot numbers and just found that the side effects were not uniformly, even pseudo-uniformly spread across the lots. But what this other colleague has done is to say, well, look, let's compare, let's look at the thing that's most comparable. So she looked at all the injected products against influenza. And it turns out, as you can see, it's decades of data, and it's about 23,000 lots, manufacturing lots. And if you look to the right, the COVID mRNA vaccines, 5 lines down, similar number, 25,000. So they're similar numbers of lots. But if you look at the serious adverse events, you can see like a 5-fold difference there from 9,000 to 47,000. And in terms of deaths, I think that's like 8 times worse. So something very peculiar is happening. We go to the next slide, please. Now, these next couple of slides are the crucial ones. So along the bottom there are the meaningless to me numbers associated with all these injectable flu vaccine products over many, many years. And on the vertical axis are the number of serious adverse events. And you can see there were just a couple of exceptions, one with about 22 serious adverse events. A serious adverse event is something that would bring you to hospital, extend your hospital stay, could threaten your life, require urgent intervention to save your life, something like that. These are not a sore arm or a bad headache. This is something really bad. But with the exception of the one on the left there, with 23 serious adverse events, a lot might contain several tens of thousands of doses. We don't know what it is every time, but what we can say is that since as I'll show in a moment, since the number of adverse events can vary thousands of fold, it's not possible for the difference in batch size or lot size to be the whole explanation for the differences. Might contribute to it, but we've done some preliminary examination where we have managed to find out exactly how many doses there were in a group of lots. And when we looked at the relationship between the number of doses in the batch and the number of adverse events in the batch, there's no relationship. So that's not the driver. So with the flu vaccines, there were just 2 lots. We don't know why that was. Something went wrong, and there were a relatively large number, 22 and 37. But look at the rest. Hundreds and hundreds, thousands, it's tens of thousands of lots where on average, my eye is telling me that the sort of smoothed average is around 4 serious adverse events per lot. But more importantly than that, I think you'll agree, it kind of looks like static. Just, it's a background noise. Remember, if you dose a large population, you could dose them with saline and get this effect, because people do get ill. You might put on red socks today and have a heart attack. Obviously, the red socks didn't cause your heart attack. But if you were tracking the relationship between your new product with socks and side effects, you would end up with a product with a profile that looks like this. So side effects associated with an intervention does not necessarily mean that it's bad. As I mentioned earlier, this sort of correlation is not causation. But I wanted, and this is really good work by my colleague, I wanted to show you what we think is a normal, well-manufactured, consistent, high-quality product looks like in the real world when you give it to, millions of people over time. So now with that established, and the baseline is around 4, and the highest value was 37. Corvin, if you could show us the next slide. I think it is the next slide, yes. So this, by now, should start to take your breath away. So these are the COVID vaccines. There are 3 manufacturers, because it's the US commercial utilities. So it's just these 3. We don't know about AstraZeneca. But remember I said that the rolling average was about 4 adverse events. Well, the scale on the y-axis here, 4 is thicker than the axis. The thin blue line at the bottom is more than 4. And the red line, this is the worst ever. You can see there was like a single case out of 22,300 flu vaccine batches that was 37. But really, that's probably way over what the representative was somewhere around 4. But there you go, that's the top. Look how many batches of COVID products are worse than that. And yet, let me just point out, for example, right in the center there, 651, 483, 5461, looks like it's either 1 or 2. And then its neighbor 1 or 2, its neighbor 1 or 2, its neighbor 1 or 2. And then suddenly you come on this one here, EN 6201, and it looks like it's 600 serious adverse events. Again, these are the ones that are, if you had a serious adverse event yourself, you would think, thank God I didn't die. It was quite close to death. And look at the number of them. And so a number of things I want to point out here. One is the extreme level of side effects that we're seeing, orders of magnitude. I would say just the rolling average here is looking like, I don't know, between 100 and 200 instead of 4. that these are really toxic products. They really are toxic products, and that's bad enough. But as I argued, if you were a cancer sufferer, you might accept a dangerous intervention if on balance it could extend your life and its quality by a year or so. But these products have been given to the general public, most of whom are perfectly well. That's the normal deal with the vaccine. You're perfectly well, you turn up at the doctor's office, get an injection, and you leave, and you're still perfectly well. And all that's happened is you've acquired a defense against a specific pathogen. That's the deal. What we shouldn't have is that you occasionally get seriously ill and some of you die. That's not a good deal. That is what is happening from these products. And they're being pushed on everyone when, as I've argued, if you're recovered, infected, you're immune. If you're a child, you're not vulnerable to the virus. Just healthy young people not, and pregnant women, we do not know that it's safe and should not, on the precautionary principle, be administering it. And yet your governments are pushing these on you. It's not a public health measure. If it was a public health measure, the 3 or 4 things I just said would be true. It's not a public health measure. And all of the stuff I said earlier about discarding normal pandemic handling plans and replacing them by absurd lies that have had the effect of frightening people, and we think that was the objective. Now you've seen this information, and your economies are on the verge of absolute extinction. And so I think that's the evil triumvirate: frighten people, damage the economy, persuade them or force them as necessary to accept these injections, some of which are killing people. Why would they want to do that? This is why I got to the conclusion. I racked my brain. There may be other explanations. It's not money, by the way. The pharmaceutical companies, of course, are having an absolute field, a high watermark in terms of profitability. That cannot be the motive. It's the effect of using big pharma to drive these products into the population. That can't be the motive. Why can't it be the motive? Because there are huge numbers of industry sectors that are absolutely almost into the ground. The airline industry, I don't know how they're surviving. Almost 2 years of non-normal operation. Hotel and catering, holiday trade, and all of these things. So remember that the only people who could possibly make this happen, or at least have to agree in order that this happens in their world, would be the owners of, the people who own what Catherine Austin Fitts calls, Mr. Global big capital. So I'm absolutely sure that money alone, profit alone, is not the motivation, because eight, there might be a couple of sectors doing really well, but 8 sectors are doing so badly as to more than outweigh the benefits that accrue to the drug companies. But let's just go back to that slide, please, Colvin, if we could. Yeah. Because there's something, not just is there this extreme toxicity, but it's the variability. Now, I pointed out, so let's just look at the Pfizer bunch, because there's a nice range there. Nice is the wrong word, sorry. I'm sounding like a scientist. These are people. These are people who've suffered, and some of whom have died. But as you cast your eye across the axis at the bottom, you can see that some of the numbers there are associated with very small numbers. They're so small that you can't see it registering on the thickness of the x-axis marked, y-axis marked 0. And yet close to it, there are a whole bunch of batches that have got, 400, 600 serious adverse events per lot, and they're roughly the same size. That means there's not the same product that's got this Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine. It says on the box or on the vial, it's not the same stuff. It's not the same stuff. I'm certain. It's not an assessment. It's not maybe. I'm absolutely certain. There is something called the law of mass action, which applies to all biological properties I've ever seen. And if it does come to court, I will just walk you through the history of that and why it is that shape, and why this means it cannot be the case that these middle Pfizer lots are the same material as the ones immediately to the left and to the right. These drug companies are highly professional outfits. They know how to manufacture reproducibly, and we saw that with the flu vaccines over decades. They know how to do it. They haven't done it. I'm afraid I've come to the conclusion that they're doing it on purpose because they're so professional. And after a year, they know this data. This data is their It's their window onto the world. They can go into VAERS, they can filter for their own products and their own lot and batch numbers, and they can see what's happening. They know. So the fact they haven't stopped this tells me that they're at least okay with it, and I fear that this is deliberate. Why might it be? Why might it be deliberate? Well, as we have seen over the last 2 years, big tech like Google, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and so on have persistently said we're not having anyone making a comment or a recording that disagrees with what the public health officials say, and we're going to call that misinformation, and we're going to basically will censor you and maybe deplatform you. What that means is that a qualified person like me, and I promise I have no axe to grind whatsoever other than telling you what I think is true, which is that we're facing a global crime. People like me cannot speak to the public because the tech companies have decided not to let me. And that's true of mainstream TV, mainstream radio. I've only ever appeared on radio where they maligned me. They just told me lots of lies. So I then threatened them, and then they deleted the recording, which tells you something, doesn't it? That I was correct. So what do I? Yes. So it's the combination of big tech, big media, and by that I mean mainly TV around the world. They control what's coming into your house. So if you just turn your TV on over the last 2 years in the same way that you ever have, you're only going to hear a one-sided, and in my view, it's mendacious. It's a completely misleading description of what's going on. You'll never hear things like this, and you should see both sides of it. The fact you're not allowed to, I think, tells you that they know there's something bad going on, and they're going to make damn sure that people like Dr. Mike Yeadon and Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Peter McCulloch and so on will never darken the studios of BBC or CNBC, because if we were given an hour, I think we could destroy this story easily. I think we're plausible, we're being honest, and I gain absolutely nothing from making up stories I'm describing in horror. So I've said that the variability is extreme, and I've said that the media controls the message and they censor people like me. If they want to tell you that there's a nasty variant that's just come along that's killing more people than previously, you've no way of knowing if that's true or not. And I don't think you should trust anything they say about this, because they've definitely lied about everything else I've been able to hear. But let's say they did say that. Let's say they said there's a new variant or a new virus that's, say, 10 times more lethal than COVID. And don't worry, the innovative pharmaceutical industry has rustled up a new vaccine, and run and get your top up, your booster, your new vaccine. What happens if they chose to give you that one that's called EN6201 instead of the one to EN1201? Well, the answer is, probably thousands of people are going to die. And imagine all the manufacturers doing that, and over time and across the world. All the time, the media is giving you a very frightening message. And the appropriate response, if these guys were being honest, would be, okay, let's deploy these vaccines as we tune them and so on. But it's all lies, it's all misleading. And I worry that what you've seen in front of you there, I've described it to other people. I said, I'm worried that this is calibration of a killing weapon. That if somebody wanted to say that there are viruses or vaccines that are, say, 10 times more lethal than COVID, so killing 1 in 100 people instead of 1 in 1,000 roughly, they could just move along and just deploy batch X or batch Y or batch Z. And that's what would happen. And, I've got no reason to make this stuff up. I've never been a conspiracy theorist. If anything, I would be the sort of person that would chuckle at other people having conspiracy theories. And of course, now I realize what a mug I've been for the last 61 years, believing what I've been told. So the bottom line, you can see it from here. It's not the same stuff in each glass bottle. That's an offence in all sorts of ways against the Adulterated Drugs Act. It cannot be accidental because they are professionals that know how to manufacture consistently. It's not possible that this is small variation in product because it's an emergency situation, difficult to make. No, the law of mass action would mean that in order to get these enormous differences in, quotes, performance, serious adverse events, would have to have a sizable difference. I would say, I don't know, 10 to 100-fold difference in an active. If there was an active that produced these side effects, I'm confident, and we did the experiments, and I'd be roughly right. I've done hundreds of experiments like that, not with people, of course. And we'd need to go up in dose by 30, 100, 300 to go from baseline to these numbers. I'm absolutely sure about that. I'd bet a lot of money on it. So because they're good at manufacturing, and because this data is available, it's been available to them all the time. They can look as the VA ERS data comes in. So they've known about this, and that means they're good with it. They're good with it. So it's either intentional, or if whatever. If it has proven too difficult to manufacture, they should still not be allowed to discharge these, as it were, into the public environment, because they're very lethal. I'm trying to think. There's something very important I was going to say. Yes, some people have said to me, Mike, these are brand new products, as you've said. And early on, we heard, I think the Pfizer product had to be stored at like -80 centigrade. So that means they're a bit unstable, rather unstable. Maybe, Mike, what's happening is they're just going off. Occasionally, bad handling, people not used to a cold chain, what's called a cold chain like this. Well, I don't think that's true. One, when products degrade, they generally lose activity. A piece of it falls off. If you imagine a car degrading, might lose one wheel and the top part of the engine. It doesn't suddenly turn into a lethal, flying machine. It will lose function, and that's what I would expect to happen. Now, on a one-off, maybe a novel product like this might break in half, and you end up with 2 super toxic bits of mRNA. But we're seeing the same thing with 3 products made by 3 different companies, and we're seeing 2 different technologies. So Moderna and Pfizer are mRNA. The Janssen is a DNA. No, it's not possible. I've just said the rule of thumb is degradation results in loss of function, not acquisition of exquisite toxicity. And we've got 3 products and 2 technologies doing that. No, that's not the explanation. And here's the thing, I have no idea what it is they have done, but I'm more frightened of these vaccines than I was before seeing this work with my colleague. So I think that's the long and short of it, really. So all of the early stuff, you're being lied to, and I can prove that in several occasions. And I would like, as I say, to direct people who haven't seen me before to my interview with Adele Bigtree on Highwire, and that I think will educate you on what I was seeing as the principal lies. And then I certainly would like to attach a short, I think it's 16 minutes with 3 or 4 people talking, that will provide you convincing evidence that the authorities knew that asymptomatic transmission was complete garbage. And if that's true, and it's true, it's garbage, everything else falls to pieces. And then when we come to the vaccines, if they were a public health measure, they'd be directed only to the people who most could get benefit from it, and never to children, healthy young people, pregnant women, and those who've already recovered. And yet, coach and horses has been driven right over those. So that's about where they are. And the reason I'm here is I want to work with anyone through the Corona Committee and anywhere else that can help wake people up, because I don't know how to fix this, but if enough people say, we've had enough now, we're not going to comply with it anymore. I noticed in Northern England, there were a group of several thousand children from secondary school in Lancashire, and they formed a union. And Wolfgang and I were talking about unions a few days ago, and they just said, do you know what? We're not wearing the mask to school anymore. And no, we're not going to put these cotton buds up our nose twice a week, not doing it anymore. And that's all we need to do, because I am telling you, there's no unusual threat in your environment except from your government and their policies and the pharmaceutical industry. There's nothing going on other than the sort of psychological warfare and the economic damage, and then these wretched vaccines. So we can still take our old normal, hopefully in a better form, back. But it requires us to just take a little courage in our hand and say, I do not comply anymore. I do not comply. And you're not doing anyone any good by complying. You're not saving yourself. You're certainly not saving your children. So that's all you need to do. And they can't arrest everybody, right? 1 or 2 people decide to demonstrate, they could be arrested. If 10,000 school children say, we're not going to school with masks and testing, and they just cross their arms and say, what are you going to do then? That's how you take it back. That's how we take it back. Anyway, I'll pause now because I've talked for quite a long time, I think.
Mike, can I ask you a question, Mike?
Yes.
About the graphs with the x-axis.
Yes.
Do we assume that there has been an alternation between the batches or the lots with the most adverse events between the three different companies, in the sense that in a temporal dimension, not all of the adverse batches have been, let's say, released at the same time? Can we deduce that?
No. There was an initial analysis done by one of the team, and they made the assumption, a reasonable but incorrect assumption, that the alphanumeric number ordering was the same as time ordering of release of the vaccines. And because of that assumption, they produced a really worrying pattern of very toxic batches, then a gap, then slightly less toxic, then a gap, then less toxic, and so on. And we can't make that deduction anymore. It might be true, but I don't think that analysis was being done. And similarly, we have not yet looked to see whether the most toxic Janssen batch was released at the same time as the least toxic Pfizer batch. We would have to do additional work. Personally, I don't think that was necessary, because the manufacturer, they know exactly where each batch goes, which state, which medical center, which office, and then eventually which patient's arm. They do know where every dose has gone. And so you could have toxic batches from more than one company being administered at the same time. I think if you're raising an implicitly very important question, actually, because I think by chance you would think there'd be sometimes an overlap and sometimes not. And if we see a pattern that looks non-natural, right, I think that would be additional strong evidence of premeditation. So we should go and do that. I think it's a very good question. So I can't answer your question, but I think I understand what was behind it, Robin, if that was what was behind it.
And the last one was again about the patterns, whether we can assume that or not yet. And as you answered, maybe we can find out more. When we look at this graph, it seems that the adverse events numbers step up, and almost, especially in the Pfizer one, and peak, and then step down. Is that again just the way that the batches have been organized around the x-axis, which is arbitrary, or is there any? Could we see any pattern of stepping up and step it down, which would
also an
experiment?
It does look, that bit does look real for any one manufacturer if you just sort of slice them out from their others on that graph, because you can deduce date order for a manufacturer. So I think if you look at that Pfizer block, I think it goes from left to right, from January 2021 to last month, something like that. And so the general trend is to lowering of numbers of serious adverse events. What I don't know is that because the number of doses being administered per day or per week, has that flattened off? Because we're now mostly in the phase, I think, of administering what they call boosters or third doses. Or it could be, well, the number of possibilities. So why is the number of adverse events in unit time reducing now? Because it does seem to be that. It could be that the system is being played with. It could be that we're simply not seeing all the data. They call that throttling. I don't know what that means, but it's basically somebody might be cheating and holding back some of those records. That's possible.
They don't need to put them in an order so that you can see a linear decline. They don't need it. They just can do it in a way which seems to be arbitrary, which seems to be by chance.
Yeah.
But they know which batch contains what, and they can have a dose, and have this surgeon, the dose finding studies with this toxicity studies, and we don't see a systematic thing. We just see a big cloud of many dangerous batches, and then we see the baseline. So, but
you're right, Wolfgang. You're absolutely right. The manufacturers can recreate the batch numbers and their empirical findings, and so they know. I presume they know what
different regions.
Yeah,
they can place them in different regions, and they can supply them here and there so that there is no systematic visible.
Exactly that. That's another thing. Actually, I forgot to mention that if this was innocent, then you would expect, would you not, that a batch or a lot would go to, on average, the same number of states each time. So whether that range is 2 to 10 or 3 to 4, whatever it is, you would expect them to be doing the same kind of thing. It might vary a little bit because obviously some states like New York, California, Florida, Texas are very big, and others like Vermont or whatever are quite small. But as you smear the doses across the nation and go down the age band, you would expect a batch that seems benign should go to the same number of states as the batch that turns out to be toxic, if it was innocent. And we need to go and check this, but certainly as of a couple of weeks ago, our findings were the most toxic batches were going to the largest number of states. And if that's confirmed, right, and again, evidence of premeditation, how would they know ahead of time to dilute the most toxic batches across the largest numbers of states? Well, there isn't. No.
There is even this trick to disguise the whole thing, because they recommended the first shot and second shot, take a different one.
Yes.
And if you do this, it's even more difficult to find out the systematic which is in it.
Good point. No, that's yes. I'm not sure. Yes, I think in most nations, I don't know. Actually, I'm not sure. I thought in most nations they got the same material, but they did mix them up. Yes.
They did explicitly recommend to take a different one the next time.
And that's so crazy, Wolfgang, isn't it? I mean, the clinical trials were not done like that, so we have no safety data for that. And so when you see things like that, ladies and gentlemen, you should be very afraid, because people like
there is one other dimension. We just see the very actual reactions of the health reactions or toxic reactions. We don't see the long-term damage which may occur, and so something is in the cloud we do not yet recognize. But because they have all the data and they have all this data collection of the people with the health data, they have the vaccination data, they have the testing data, and they have the genetic data, even if they analyze the PCR. So they can really find out a lot by those trials they do this.
Yes.
And find out whether the patents are worthwhile to be further developed or not.
No, it's a very good point you make, Wolfgang, that yes, that whilst we know an unprecedentedly large number of people have reported injury and indeed death, the numbers of deaths they're huge for a vaccine, but they're not large, say, compared with the normal death rate. So in advanced, plump, elderly Western populations, somewhere around 1%, just under 1% of the population, mostly the old people, die every year. And if the vaccines have killed as many as 1 in 1,000, which is like a tenth, that would be awful and a terrible crime. But it's not on its own going to move the needle on population. But if they do propose, either to return with more toxic materials in the future, or to Wolfgang's point, maybe 9,999 people haven't yet learned what's in store for them. If you've been given one of these materials, I just don't know what's in it. Does that prime you for a very serious medical event if you should encounter some second stimulus? If I was a bad person, I could definitely design some nasty things using this technology easily.
Yeah, Mike, you have the experience. You know how long it takes to prepare such a study.
Yeah.
And so it is not just a study which is just improvised, but it's a study. It seems to me this is an experiment they prepared at least 10 years ago, because you have all those vaccines that now are on running in trials. Yes. 128 says WHO, with 2 of them with self-replicating viruses, and this was published long ago. We just heard it. The veterinary, they tried it out with animals already, self-replicating viruses, and now it's in the clinical studies with all those 120 different.
Wolfgang is saying, and he's absolutely right. I can exemplify. it's far too fast. If those programs were initiated in response to, December 2019 and onwards, then that's just 2 years, something like that. The preclinical phase, the amount of time we would spend in the lab thinking about it, doing experiments, optimizing, selecting the drug candidate, manufacturing it, doing toxicology, it would be extremely unlikely that anyone had got into the clinic. Maybe you could go more quickly these days, but if they're all in phase 2, I'm afraid.
Mike, you know better than anyone that those people know what they want to show for their investors and what they want to hide.
Yeah, no, that's true. But that's very worrying. Yes. Go ahead.
To ask like 2 things. Like one thing is it possible to see like what kind of age group were affected by the respective toxic batches? And the other thing is like when we talked about this beforehand, you said that there's only very few people maybe needed to do these kind of variations if it's done on purpose. I mean, it wouldn't change anything because obviously it's out there to see for everyone, both for like government plus for the pharmaceutical companies themselves. So, I mean, if it was like a natural process or like just a problem of production, they would immediately interfere and change the system or take out try to resolve the problem or even like put like a moratorium on it or something like that. So it's clear that it's it's very likely that it's something like on purposeful that's going on. But like how many people would you actually see to be involved? And also would it be possible to look at the age toxicity?
Yeah. So I've noted that question. It's a good one. I'll get back to the team, and I think it might be useful to have a different person from the team because there are so many very good questions. They may know the answers, and I just don't. Like I said, I'm not the actual analyst. But to your question about how many people would need to be involved, and it's rather worrying that it might be a very small number. If you think about it, they're basically gene sequences. So they're either sequences of RNA bases, one joined to another, or DNA bases. And we have machines that will synthesize that. And then once you've synthesized it, you can then copy it, ironically, using PCR. It was originally invented as a manufacturing technique, not an analytical technique. So the process is fully automated. Once you program what it is you want the machine to make, and maybe it makes it in pieces, as I was describing for drug substance earlier, maybe it's made in a few pieces, and you warrant that each of the pieces is what you want, and then you anneal them together using molecular biology. That could be how they do it. But when the machine is humming away and manufacturing the gene sequence, it looks exactly the same to a supervisor or a shift worker putting raw materials in and whatever it's making, looks exactly the same. So it could be as little as one controlling mind for the whole thing, certainly per company. You don't have to have a team of 40 sort of cogitating and arguing. If you know what you're doing and all you're going to do is change the code, one person would be enough. Of course, I don't know what they're doing. Some people have said, oh, maybe they've added a chemical. I don't know. I literally don't know. But if they haven't, they might have just modified the gene sequence so that a different effect than the one we expected to happen will actually happen. And I don't know how we're going to get it out of them. These things are actually very hard. I don't want to go over this in great depth, but when I first heard that they were using these and intending them as a mass vaccination, when I left Pfizer 10 years ago, techniques or materials like this were almost a laboratory curiosity. We did attempt to use them in some experiments in cells and cell culture, and they didn't work very well. There were toxicities associated with them. Delivery to the inside of cells was problematic. Stability of the material, even identity of what you were adding to the cell culture was often difficult to be really sure about. And so the idea that within 10 years, numerous companies are able just to manufacture these like M&Ms and Smarties, that doesn't fit for me. It's not possible.
I think we have some big responsibility now.
Yeah,
because we have to think to spread this news. And I find it very, very interesting that there is this homepage where you can find out how bad is my batch.
Yeah. That's one of the team. One of the team has.
I tried to find it in Google, but I did not get it. Google hides it. And I have put it on my homepage. You have to take a different searching machine and have to different internet programs to find it. But it's very good. All batches are there, even the actual ones that I use now that are on the market.
Wow.
And I have to say to all doctors, please, doctors, now when you know that there are dangerous ones and that there are less dangerous ones, if you really go on giving those jabs, you should at least have a look whether the batches you got to inject are those which are dangerous, where you kill your patients, or whether they are less they make less harm. But this, and also the pharmacists, what they have in their stock, they should have a look, and they should try to find out, and first have to know what sort of batch they use, and then, or they should use, and then give it. But and every patient too, he should ask his doctor. And he said, "Doctor, did you check it? Whether it's a batch or not?" And this makes the doctor even be aware that there are bad batches. And even if the doctor starts thinking, then he will find out, why are there bad batches and good batches?
Mm-hmm.
This is not possible.
No.
If I give an injection and there's some label on it, it should always be the same one. What does he say to the patient? And perhaps he has a look on this information, and he starts thinking. I think this is a very important thing we have to tell the patients. Yet, if you are forced to take the jab, ask your doctor, is it a good batch or is it a bad batch?
Yeah.
You know there are good and bad batches.
No, I think it's very important.
I show you the literature. I show you the literature, doctor.
Yeah.
Please tell me, is this a good? I come back when you can tell me whether it's a good one or a bad one. Then I'll come back. But now I don't take it. It's too dangerous, doctor.
Yeah.
You have to do it like this.
Yeah, and
then you can bring all those people that they start thinking and that start researching themselves what's going on.
Yeah, the one that you're mentioning, we've published one of them on the Telegram channel, and it's howbad.info.
Yes.
There may be more, but the one that we put on our Telegram channel is howbad.info, so people can check there.
I would like to ask one additional question. So are we sure that these vaccines are really produced, like, for instance, on a Pfizer plant or like a Johnson & Johnson plant? Because there's also companies who do the production process for like pharmaceutical products. Like, for instance, I think there's a company called Emerging Biosolutions. And I heard, I'm not quite sure, that they are involved in this kind of production process as well. So it could be that it's actually like maybe just one plant of a supplier who makes all these vaccines with the like the ingredients according to the protocol of each company. The pseudo or like the seeming protocol, but then we maybe have other protocols going on at the same time. But it could be that it's not really on one plant of the visible producer.
You're absolutely right. People may not know this, but yes. Although during my career, lots of companies acquired one company after another, what they didn't do is keep everybody. Because I remember at one point, one of my employees had like 47 production plants around the world. And it's clearly, that was just a consequence of 4 or 5 or 6 companies all rolling up together. And so what happened was, over time, some of those plants, they went through what's called, I think it's a management buyout, an MBO, and they would acquire several of the estates of manufacturing, and then they would provide a contract manufacturing specialty to the industry, not just their former owners. And you are right, I won't name them because it kind of could blacken their name and they might not be involved. But yeah, there is a whole parallel industry of contract manufacturers. And theoretically, of course, their job ought to be to be highly skilled in sort of regulatory quality manufacture. And so that lifts the burden off the drug company. Of course, in the end, what is it that the drug company does? It's a friend of mine remarked that it's a bank with a drugstore on the side of it. Really,
that's what they've become. Clinical research organizations. What about the clinical research organizations? You think there are big ones who are able to manage all this?
Yeah, again, most of the research is now tolled out. So the manufacturer, Moderna would be in charge of whatever it is that's being done. But the execution, the recruitment of patients, their screening, the pre-randomization visits, administering the substance, the daily, weekly, monthly follow-up, and so on, all of that would be managed through clinical CRO, clinical contract research organization. That's true of toxicology, manufacture, clinical. And so, in the end, it's what's the core skill of the drug company? And I can't tell you anymore. And that's why a friend said they're like a bank with a drugstore on the side. And I don't really know what it is that's at the heart of these organizations anymore. It used to be, certainly Pfizer was very famous for having drug discovery at its core, and it was led by people who are generally medicinal chemists rather than biologists. So Wellcome was very much sort of biology-led. There's nothing wrong with either. You have to have those kind of skills. But what are they led by now? I would think profit motive and litigation expertise, because they know they're going to get sued. And so as long as they make much more money than they pay in fines, it seems to me that's unfortunately the sad end of what used to be an industry I was proud to work in. Not anymore. Even if I could, I wouldn't serve any of these organizations anymore. They've permanently done themselves in my eyes.
Could I sort of, in addition to my question, does it show on the sheets that come with the product where it's actually been produced?
I don't think so. I don't believe so. No, you wouldn't be able to tell whether it was made in New Jersey or New Amsterdam, whatever. I don't think so. The company will know because there will be this identifying code, and they damn well better know not just where it was manufactured. They better know where all the raw ingredients came in and who signed off step 3. Seriously, if they don't know that stuff, they're breaking the law. Because in order to do good manufacturing practice, you need to know the answer to that question. If a skilled investigator said, I want to know, everything about that particular batch. I want to know what was the starting material 3 months ago, and what did you do to warrant that the supplier that sold it to you had the right quality and purity and safety and so on. Every part of that needs to be demonstrated. So and that's why I think it cannot be an accident, because the normal discipline, which is it's almost obsessive, and rightly so, means that you can't end up with products with performance variability like this, because that implies different stuff in the vial, and that just can't happen by accident. So, but how many actors are involved? It could be lots or a few. So again, if we were thinking of how could something illegal be hidden, one would think it's not as hard as one might think. It really isn't.
Just let us think. Where should I send the state attorney to find out?
Where shall I?
Where should we look for the files? Is it the clinical research organization?
One question, because you always said that, for instance, the Paul-Ehrlich-Institute, that they would need to have kept some of the vials for retesting, or I don't know what the term is for that. But would they know where these products were produced?
I think they just rely on the data they get from the producers. This is what they said. They said, we have a contract with them, and they have conditions they have to fulfill, and they have to give us a report, and we rely on the report of the producers. They don't do it themselves, I think, but I don't know it.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. You rely on the assurances that are made and the internal sort of quality control processes of your supplier or your client, whatever it is, as it passes down the chain. Because clearly it's not possible to personally warrant that all the starting materials are exactly what you say. So you have a series of nested quality control and audit. So, audit is the most appropriate way, because when you do an audit, you can take a cross section through any part of the research, development, and commercialization of a product, and they would do that. Experienced people.
Who pays that? He has a lot to say.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so, if you end up with the regulators being funded by the drug companies, which I think is true, actually. It's called PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act.
I asked some people who make the pharmaceutical controls in the countries, in German Länder. They have pharmacists who normally control whether what is written on the label is in the drug, and they are not able to do it now with these new drugs. They are not able to. You have to sequence, or you have special techniques. So it's not possible to control it that it is done by those institutions that are normally protecting us from such a thing. Yeah, they are not able to do it.
No, I agree. The analysis is not straightforward as it would be for in the sake of in the case of a pill that contains, say, 50 milligrams of whatever, some new antiviral. The chemical structure would be declared, and therefore the analytical performance, the wavelengths of absorption of light, and the molecular sizes of a fragment of it in a mass spectrometer, all of those things, we would know how to confirm that it is what they say. But these, I think some of the genetic bases, RNA and DNA, are non-natural. I think they've modified them. There's nothing wrong with that as long as you declare it. But what it means is that in order to stabilize the product, some of the bases are non-natural, so they're not found in nature, and some of the analytical techniques won't pick them up. You may need to develop a new methodology even to check the product. So it's tricky, really tricky.
Yeah. If they would be forced to tell the sequences, exact sequences, you could make a PCR to find the sequences.
Yes.
And the PCR could be spread, and all the control institutions could use the PCR and use it with the drug, and they could see whether the sequences are in or not. But they would not find those sequences they don't know.
No.
They only won't find those sequences which are labeled, and so this doesn't help us.
No. Yes, that's right. Even if you had a pure sample, just a solution, and you wanted to establish what was in it, if you don't know which non-natural nucleic acid, RNA and DNA, if you don't know which ones they've used, you cannot then design an analytical system to sequence it, because it'll be wrong if you. It's a serious problem. It really is. It's no good just seizing a sample. You couldn't have the police go in and seize the samples, and then a week later we'd know what it is. So you can't measure that which you're not even knowing to look for. Again, that's something I learned in my forensic science placement. It's incredibly difficult to work out what's in a person, if they've died, or in a vial in this case. Unless if you start by you have some presumptions, then you can confirm those or show that it's not true. That's the routine technique. If you don't know, for example, what's killed a person, and you have a suspected death, if you don't know what to look for, it's incredibly hard. And the same is true here. We don't. I could imagine many different schema that would produce the effect that we've got, but there could be 100 others, and might be none of the above. So unless somebody leaks this information, all we can do is present both the public, the professionals like Drs. Wolfgang, as you said, and the companies themselves. If someone will hold them legally to account, then they would have to answer questions as to, well, how are these erratic performing batches? How has that come about? That would be my first question.
I think
if you agree that's the record, how did that happen?
We have enough information with this variation of toxicity. We have enough information to stop all of them.
Yes.
Normally, we have concerning the legal framework of pharmaceutics, we could now say no, not one single jab anymore, because we have these findings. This is enough normally for the
Yes, that's a very good point, actually. I should have made and will make again. Yes, that in view of the fact that a team has established, and these are independent people, we came together because we had this common interest. We didn't come together and then do the work. So these are people who've come from very different skill sets. But we all agree that there is extreme variation in the toxicity profile. That we all agree that there are some other nuances that,
so it's clear
if they're true, there is some emerging data that suggests you may have seen a film called Death by Alphabet, and at least for one manufacturer, it does horribly. It looks like the ordering of toxicity does relate to the alphabetical sequencing of a middle letter in the code. But I'm not in a position to say whether that's true or not, but I can assure you we're doing additional work. Additional work is going on. So, Rhino, if that were to turn out to be the case, that clearly can't be chance, I don't think. So, if that's true, that would greatly augment the case. But yes, Wolfgang, personally, I would have been satisfied. Well, as you and I know, back in December 20, we thought it was inappropriate to use these at all. That it would have been better to have allowed early treatment to have been used, and I think it would have meant only the people who needed intervention would have received it, and everyone else be left alone. Whereas this mass vaccination is introducing dangerous, poorly characterized materials that are also now being manufactured in a very suspicious way, are being given to a very high percentage of the population. And as I've said before, there's very clear evidence of heavy-duty deception, censoring, and control of narrative that, when you then take that together with these observations of the vaccines, could easily be at the worst end of people's worries, like depopulation. Anyone who's heard this now, I think they would be foolish to dismiss the idea that there's a takeover and that they might want to, kill quite a percentage of the world's population. It's absolutely possible. I can't know that that's what they're doing, because not my crime, as I've said before. But if you just look at the creeping authoritarianism, vaccine passports. I don't know if you've had any other speakers talking about it. I think you had Robert Malone, but just to say again, this to anyone who doubts it, if you've been vaccinated, you've received double jabs, whatever it is, of one of the products, you're not safer to be next to than I am. You're not. The evidence is they don't stop you acquiring an infection, so it doesn't do you any good, and it does not stop you transmitting it, for example, to me. I, by sheer luck, actually was ill for a few weeks in the summer, and I had a test and I was positive, so maybe I've had it. And if that's true, I've got good immunity. So I ought to be someone you would say, well, I can't give it to anyone because I can't now get clinically ill with it. So it's just nonsense. All that vaccine passports, only people they benefit are the people who are pushing them, like Gates and Blair and Schwab and other people. They do not make you safer. And it's very important that I say that, because I am very worried that, I don't know what it is. Professor Matthias Desmet said that there's this mass formation of people in greater fear than they should, but it's been pushed for that reason. If those people think vaccine passports and people who've been vaccinated are safe to be around or safer, and I'm a dirty individual who's not been vaccinated, that's not true. But if they believe it, if I try and say, look, these vaccine passports are really digital ID and they're going to remove your human liberties, they'll fight me, because they'll think I'm trying to remove something that's essential to their safety. So it's literally a diabolical scheme, because I can see how much resistance there will be to removing it, vaccine passports, if they're introduced into a society. And so and it's easier said than done, but my most earnest hope is that we stop them being introduced in the first place, if you possibly can. It's so much easier to prevent them being installed than to remove them afterwards. I don't know how to get rid of them. Sorry, Wolfgang.
Mike, they also try to make us get lost in details.
Yeah.
It's such a big crime. It's so obvious now. Don't discuss all those details they offer us to discuss.
No,
we have so many things. They send us other specialists and they speak about details and variants and area test and new test. It's a nonsense. It's a big crime, and it's so obvious now. And what we have to do is to wake up the doctors and to wake up the pharmacists and to wake up the people that they are just victims of criminals. And
yes, no, they are, exactly.
I think the people now running on the street in all German towns and everywhere in Europe and all over the world, they know it already. They know it, and they are aware. And we have to strengthen them and give them all the arguments and to persuade the other people to follow them on the street and to be on the street too, and not to say no to this crime, to this very, very big crime.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I made a short speech for the so-called Spaziergänger, the walkers that stroll around the streets in Germany. I made a short speech of 15 minutes where I tried to explain all this. We speak about now more than 1 hour. And I tried to explain it because it's so important that we give those informations and to give them the arguments to convince to all the neighbors, come out, don't tolerate this anymore.
Well, here's the thing. At this point in time, I think this must be considered the missing link. This is the smoking gun. If you look at the totality of the evidence, if you look at what we've been talking about, the fact that these vaccinations are not vaccinations, because what is a vaccine? It's something that makes you immune. Now, these shots do not make you immune. Even the makers of the vaccines admit that. They don't make you immune. They don't protect you in any way. Secondly, we've been lied to. We all know we've been lied to right from the start. Third, starting with the PCR test and asymptomatic infections. That's what they needed in order to start this whole thing, in order to get the public health emergency of international concern, which ultimately led us to the so-called vaccinations. And there's lots of censoring going on, lots of censoring. Why is that? Well, if you look at this piece, even without knowing any of the details that we've been speculating about, it is enough to show us that what is happening is this is within this gigantic experiment, they're experimenting with lethal dosages. For what purpose? For what purpose? It can only be done because they want to reduce the population without us understanding this. That's why they're experimenting with lethal dosages, because if they killed everyone in one at the first shot, it would be very obvious. So that is what's happening. That's enough for me. That's way more than enough for me, and should be way more enough for any prosecutor. We're going to get them.
I hope so. I mean, the reason, one of the reasons I also thought depopulation was likely was that early on, we had people like Bill Gates. Yes, he's a rich man, he's influential, but he's not a biologist or a doctor of any kind. Yeah. And he was on the TV saying the world won't return to normal until pretty much everyone's been vaccinated. And I thought, that's just the most stupid nonsense I've ever heard. You only need to, vaccines have never been used to extinguish a pandemic in human history. So this would be novel. So, and then next, you only vaccinate people who are themselves at severe risk of adverse effects, including death if infected. That's it. So I knew he was lying when he said that. He was not competent to say it, so he must have another reason for saying it.
Who gave him the authority?
Exactly. And he said it repeatedly, but then I'll tell you what, then I heard Blair, another well-known biologist, talking about the necessity to have these vaccine passports to reopen society. It's just, hold on, is this the same Tony Blair, former British Prime Minister, who tried unsuccessfully to introduce digital ID into the British system? Yeah, it's the same guy. So it was obvious that's what it was, even though we didn't yet know what the performance of the vaccines were, but we did know that the trials didn't include transmission. They were not looking to see whether transmission was reduced that would be the only possible argument, I think, for vaccine passports, or basically insisting that to protect society, you should be vaccinated. I would have a problem with it anyway. And I think I heard Jordan Peterson speaking about this, and he said that he thought that the measures that were being introduced, quotes, to make us safer, were likely to have a much more dangerous effect on the population and civil society than the effect of the virus. And he said they're not comparing what's the impact of these imposed measures on civil society and the rule of law and so on, compared with the unmitigated effects of the virus. And he said, clearly you need to weigh these things up. And he said, in my mind, the responses to the virus are much more dangerous to the alleged stability of society than the virus. And he's right. And it needs clever people like that just to sort of look at it from a philosophical point of view, not just science, because then you get the high priest syndrome where, if Sir Chris Whitty this or Sir Patrick Vallance that then becomes law almost. And people like, Wolfgang or myself don't get to contribute to it. And so I know Robin has been spending a lot of time talking about bodily integrity. These are not rights that your governments can give away. They're yours. We've agreed them between us as human beings through the agency of our governments over the years. We're signed up to these UN bioethics agreements that says, we're not going to allow human beings to be coerced into medical experiments. We're not going to allow it. But that's what's happening in your country. They're saying you can't go to work or to a shop or to a social event unless you take this jab. That's the same as being forced to take part in a medical experiment. That's something we've decided is never going to happen. It's in breach of half a dozen agreements and compacts physicians have with each other and their patients, between lawmakers of different countries and their citizens. They don't have the bloody rights to take that away. No. So we've got to come out on the streets and just say, hold up the sign that says, I'm not doing this anymore.
Yeah, we do not consent, because this
do not consent. You're not going to comply.
What I want to say is that I agree that Mike's presentation is from the work of the virus is a very convincing smoking gun. But I think we've got at least two smoking guns. The other one is, as you were mentioning, to do with very blatant violations of human rights. That the problem is that people don't seem to know about these rights. So we have two smoking guns. Inevitably, at the stage we are at now, where divisiveness is encouraged by the authorities, we have a very divided population, and some of them will refuse to see either one or the other, if not both, smoking guns. And in that case, it's very important to get this information that you presented today out. Inevitably, some people will reject it, as they have rejected other evidence so far. For those people, we also have to try and show them the smoking gun of leaders, very obvious leaders, including, as mentioned before, Bill Gates and Macron, who are actively using words which are in complete violation with our human rights. And that is, in my view, an incredible smoking gun. If we use their words and we compare them to what our rights are, that is a smoking gun of human rights violations amounting arguably to crimes against humanity. So we have at least two. One is medical, scientific injection and toxicity and adverse events level. And the other one is for people who maybe are less versed with even, for some people may find difficult to even understand what VAERS is. I mean, we should deal with it. So for those people, I think it's very important to show them another level of smoking gun, which is entirely to do with human rights. And as you said, bodily autonomy is something that people tend to understand, and that there's a huge push now to use the Together group in the UK to show and to talk about that aspect. So I think that there's some people may have a different vision of smoking guns. I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, no, that's very important. I think there's not been that many people with tremendous reach. I mean, I'm kind of on the lower margins, but certainly people like Malone and McCulloch and so on, and a handful of others. In a sense, I think you're alerting me, Robin, to the idea that I'm seeing this through the sort of medical scientific lens, because that's the kind of person I am. But that cannot be the only way of trying to communicate with people, because most people don't see the world through those lenses. And in fact, in a pissing competition, they're more likely to give the government the benefit of the doubt, right? And that's why I've not been comparing their opinion with my opinion. I'm saying that it's a matter of fact that they're telling you something that's not true, because now I know it's a different question. Although the matter is scientific, I'm asking them to judge whether my assertion that they're being lied to is correct, right? And if you think I sound competent and honest, and you can go and check some of the things I say and think, oh my God, that he's right, that they are telling us lies, that's a completely different category of decision for the members of the public. And so I've been exhorting my medical and scientific colleagues for about a year to say, stop engaging in pissing competitions by showing your analysis of the cases data. No one gives a shit. They're always going to ascribe a little bit more trust to government scientists than people who are knights of the realm and lord this and so on. That's what will happen. We know this from Milgram experiment. They're always going to give them the benefit of the doubt. So luckily for me, they are lying, and I can use the L word all the time. If they want to come and sue me, do you know what? I would welcome it. You will lose, you guys. You will lose. So by all means, put me in my place and sue me. I look forward to seeing you in court.
Mike, I have no doubt that if we talk to all of the experts who we've spoken to, the psychologists, the psychiatrists, the epidemiologists, immunologists, the lawyers, the economists, they will all come to the same conclusion. This is intentional, premeditated mass murder. There's absolutely no doubt about it, because nothing else makes any sense. And just by coincidence, you mentioned Bill Gates. There's two more smoking guns we have here. We have two short videos, very short video clips. One of them shows, you know them, but one of them shows him explaining about I think it's about 15 years old, explaining about the return on investment that you get from investing in pharmaceutical, in vaccine makers rather than the tech industry. And the other one shows him, he looks like a complete imbecile. He's being interviewed by the CIA, I think.
Yes.
And he looks and acts like a complete imbecile. It is inevitable. You must come to the conclusion that this is a psychopath.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. Yes, I think that's the video. Well, I think he's about 40 years old, and he's being investigated for, I don't know, inappropriate competition, something like that.
Yeah.
And he's just sort of rocking like a nutcase. And basically, he's asked the same question several times, and then he starts to dispute the meaning of the words in the question.
Yes.
Like, I think it said, what other browsers were you concerned with in the year 1990, whatever it was? He said, I don't understand what you mean by the word concern. And it's like, yeah, you definitely are. you do know what he was getting at, but he was going to not answer by just pretending. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he genuinely didn't understand what was meant on this occasion.
Oh, he did.
So yeah, do you know what? I don't get into the who's done it, because I genuinely don't know. All I know is that there are a handful of people who are part of the perpetrators. So, I mean, honestly, you couldn't come up with a more Bond villain person than Klaus Schwab. He's wonderful, isn't he? Honestly. Yeah. And, Tony Blair, come on, and then Gates. And
great from James
Ross. But honestly, I think even these people they're very wealthy puppets, but they're still puppets. I think it's the people above them. We're never going to see them. We don't probably even know their names. And I think they're the super capitalists. These are like what central banking class Catherine Austin Fitts calls them. So there's no point. I know eventually we have to accuse certain people, and they definitely are guilty of the things that we're saying. Yeah. But I don't know how you get at the people behind them. I mean, Ronnie, you probably have at least a better idea of how hard it is. But when people say, who's doing this? I go, I don't know. It doesn't make any difference. Am I going to do something different if it's person X or person Y? Not really. All I can do is tell you that you're not being told the truth, and these bloody products are dangerous, and they're lying to you, and it cannot be accidental. So that's bad enough. And just stop cooperating. Masks don't work. They can make you ill. At least they'll make you frightened. You'll look around and notice if everyone's wearing masks, surely your hindbrain, your lizard brain is telling you that means there must be a hazard. It's all about maintenance of fear so that you never can relax back into a normal life. But stop wearing the mask, stop submitting to testing, don't let them vaccinate you. You know, unless you, whatever, you don't need them anyway. They're not safe enough, these bloody things. And it was not likely, really. Warp speed. Come on, you can't invent a new class of medicine at warp speed and expect things to be all right. That's not how biology works. God and nature don't let you do that. And so, yeah, we just need to take back our power, as they say. And, you know, I think some of Robin's points are really important. You are being abused. We are all being abused by these people. The narrative, the censorship, you know, the lying, you know, it's ghastly. It's worse than anything that we would have said, you know, those people in oppressive states over there, you know, in the East or whatever, South, you know, whatever. We're worse. We are now, I think we're worse than people we've criticized in the past. I've said to people that, you know, if you think you're going to get another chance to, as it were, vote this lot out, you know, whistle for it. At the moment, democracy is dead. And all the institutions that would normally defend us are malfunctioning or corrupt. So, you know, and I've mentioned the Royal Colleges, just absolutely appalling. The Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology isn't protecting, you know, pregnant women. You know, they're not. They're actually throwing them under the bus. They're saying, go and get these not tested vaccines. And it's literally criminal. You should be ashamed of yourself. And I've said to people who are working in any of these big companies, if you've got any self-respect, you should do at least two things. One is go through the complaint process, go and see your boss. And if they won't talk to you, the boss's boss, till you're at EVP level, board member. And, you know, if you don't get good answers and you're not, then you need to resign publicly. Come on, some of you are in your late 50s. You can afford to stop earning. You know, look yourself in the mirror and be able to say, I did something to try and save my children and grandchildren. Resign, for Christ's sake. Imagine if hundreds of you, senior people in your 50s, resign all at the same time. That would be unhideable. You could do that. You should do that.
Well, I mean, to remember like what Professor Desmet said, that, you know, if it's like the hypnosis can be like kind of poked open by like a large enough shock. And, you know, this, like what we discussed today, I find this so absolutely shocking, and it absolutely grosses me out if this turns out to be correct. Because, I mean, just imagine this sort of brain or like person or like, you know, this constellation that you do something like this. I mean, you can maybe, you know, pick measures that are exaggerated or like that are, you know, maybe you have political ideas, you know, that are maybe not adequate or something. But like this thing, you know, that you'd actually do this kind of experimenting with like toxicity levels. I think this is really going to give me a very I don't know, very tough night. You know, it's nightmare inducing.
No, it is very bad. One of the reasons I came, I'm in America now, legally, I'm properly visaed. One of the reasons I came here is not just to escape what might happen in the UK, and I'm very worried about that. I mean, I have been very vocal as a critic of the government. And it occurs to me that at some point they might decide censorship is not enough and they'll just come and pick me up in a dark windowed van. I don't fancy that. But the other reason I came to America is, I'm in the southern half of America. I realized that people don't recognize evil anymore. They think that there's a continuity of like good to not very good, and maybe a bit bad. But I think you've just made the point. This is like, you know, orders of magnitude worse. This is something none of us who are not psychopaths could possibly do and still survive, still sleep. But some people are able to do this. Now, I don't know whether they've got some sort of internal justification, like, you know, the world will, the environment will be destroyed if we don't reduce the population. So this is a tough job, but I've got to do it. I think that's bullshit, by the way. But you can imagine someone kind of deciding to fool themselves like this. But like I said, I think we've come to rely, and I'm afraid I'm the most guilty of all of us. I've relied all of my life, as it were, on the scientific method. that can be done publicly as the way of deciding things that are objective. Obviously, everything else is a matter of opinion, but anything that's kind of objectively measurable, the scientific method will do. But it doesn't. It doesn't when you come to matters of the heart and of the mind, where you're not trying hard or maybe sometimes falling short. You're doing something that's evil. Scientific methods are useless. You need other tools, and I don't really know what they are, but they include religious faith or whatever, what you think is the right conduct for a human being. And that can't be found through science. And you are right. I don't want to give you a bad night, but if that is the effect of what I've said for people hearing this the first time, then I'm glad, because it's hitting home. When I can't tell you exactly when it was, but when it first occurred to me that, oh my God, the bits only fit together if this is about control and potential depopulation. I can assure you, I didn't sleep well. I didn't sleep properly for weeks. 2 hours at a time, and I would wake up, I would open my eyes, and I'd see evil just out in the dark. So whatever's going on, whatever's driving this is, it's darker than anything that's happened this century. Yeah. But unfortunately, there are numerous examples in the last century of people who are able to do this. I remember famously one of the statements of, I think, Stalin, or attributed to him, was that a single death is a tragedy and 1 million is a statistic. And I think there are plenty of people involved in this crime that think that way. Probably if they injured a person or someone close to them suffered and died, they'd cry just like you and I, but they have no problem in giving an order that will result in 10 to the 6, 10 to the 7 people dying. I think they have no problem with it. And that's
Mike, it's the same people. It's the same people who have been responsible for all of these horrific things that happened over the centuries. I remember Vera Sharaf telling me that she couldn't believe, she's a Holocaust survivor. Yeah. She couldn't believe she's still fighting the same people, or at least the same system that she fought 80 years ago. So we're dealing with the same structures. We're still dealing with the same evil-minded people. But this time, we're going to do them in. This Absolutely. Time is different.
We're definitely going to do that. Yeah, we won't stop, and there are too many of us who have woken up and more all the time. So yeah, you'll see. Hopefully, like a relay. I say to people, I describe it as a resistance relay. Do what you can. Don't be me. I don't. It's hard being me. But and each expert brings their own expertise, their own style. Things they say, but if you know that this is wrong, if you've accepted that this is wrong, then you don't need to stay quiet because you're not a scientist. It's absurd. Robbins pointed out that our human rights that we have agreed, things post-war and so on, that we've decided we're never going to do again, they're being transgressed. You can stand up and say that, and we're not taking this anymore. So the resistance relay is an idea. You don't need to have any specialty at all, other than, I guess, a backbone. If you've got a backbone and you think this is not right, that's your minimum qualification. Don't need to have any special qualifications. Just be a human being and say, we're not having this. That's all. Okay.
Michael, thank you so much. This makes a huge difference. This is, in my view, as I said, the first thing that got me when Wolfgang and I were riding the subway in Berlin over a year ago, he casually mentioned that he asked me, you know, of course, that the PCR test cannot tell us anything about infection. I pulled him back into the car and asked him, what? So that was the first smoking gun. But this is much more important, because this is going to wake up so many people.
I think they're both. I hope that's true, and it should wake up people, because it's shocking. But you are right. I think the inappropriate use of PCR, plus the lies, including asymptomatic transmission. I think that was absolutely required to establish the sort of the mass formation, to get people frightened. The irony is now that we can, the leaders are even telling us now that the masks don't work. There's question marks, being asked, or statements being made, even by senior leaders saying, "Well, these cloth masks don't work." New data, and I think Wolfgang, they've changed or withdrawn the approval for certain PCR tests. So now, I would like to attach, Corbin, the two interviews I've got, the one with the High Wardale Bigtree, but also this accumulation of 16 minutes of film, which has Fauci and Kokov telling you that asymptomatic transmission has never been the driver of respiratory viral epidemics. Yes. That's the exact quote. That's all I'm saying. So I don't know why you think I'm a conspiracy theorist. I'm saying what he has said. It's just he's changed his tune. Every few weeks he says something different, and then suddenly he is the science. It's just nonsense. He's a liar, and he's, you know, anyone who follows him, given the evidence of his repeated lies, you know, I'm afraid is a bit foolish. And I asked them to, you know, look at this in the round. It's not normal what's going on, is it? No. And it's no one. You know, I've been told no one's coming to save us. I know there are some people. I know some people who know it's not right, but they're kind of sitting tight. They don't know what to do, and they said, if I speak out, I'll lose my job. I say, if you don't speak out, you will lose your liberty permanently.
And your life.
And possibly your life. Certainly, you will lose your liberty permanently. Mm-hmm. You know, so I don't understand that. The people are choosing. They can get another bloody job, even if you do get fired. You know, take a holiday. You know, say to yourself, I'm going to speak out because it's the right thing to do. And if I get fired, I'll be jobless for a year. You know, the people who are professionals that are earning big salaries can easily cope with a year of not having any income. It's different if you're like 30-something and you're the sole breadwinner. I understand. You know, you're looking after 3 or 4 people. I'm not asking you to sacrifice your job. That's crazy. But honestly, you senior consultants, people in your 50s and 60s, get off your butt. You know, make public statements, make them fire you. You know, take them to court. You're strong enough to do that. And you've got the resources to do that. If you don't do that, you've allowed your children and grandchildren just to be ground underneath the tracks of this monster. That's what you're doing. So stop it. We can do it. All right,
we will do it. These are crimes against humanity. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But we do have a few friends of humanity amongst us as well.
Good stuff. All right. Well, good afternoon, good evening, and to anyone who's spent all the time watching, thank you for your patience. I wish I could do the short form, but sometimes you have to have the long form in order to then, you know, take the skinny from it. So thank you very much for watching, and you know, do something with what you've heard today, please.
The world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who look at them without doing anything. Become our supporter. Together we can win.